So in 2022, I did a project, Creative Scotland funded project called Jazz at the Third Eye, sharing the venue's archive and commissioning responses from contemporary Glasgow artists. And I'll share a link to that at the end of the talk. But I just wanted to say that in addition to the incredible Third Eye video archive, which you'll see some of today, I was lucky to have access to John Gilmore's wonderful photography, and you'll see some. That's one example there with Tom McGrath. He's the one laughing in the check shirt, with George Lyle, the bassist, Nick Weston, the drummer, and John Longbottom, the sax player. And that photo was taken at Glasgow Arts Club, I think, or which is now the Ottoman Coffee House. So yeah, you can still get in that beautiful building. It has the stained glass and everything still. Um, so in addition, I also had access to some really fantastic archival material, flyers, gig tickets, courtesy of Edward Kitchen and Alan McFarlane, who were both musicians, music fans, who were around at the time. So again, they'll be in the slides. So this paper is about jazz and poetry, and it's also about Capital's jazz and poetry, as in the interdisciplinary practice popularized by the Beats in the 1950s, and which really arguably reached its apex with the Black Radical movement in the 60s. Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Joseph Jarman, and more recently has kind of had a resurgence with people like Moore Mother, Fred Moten, and Brandon Lopez. That's when, because I think the more kind of beat-oriented stuff can be quite easy to parody. I'm sure you've seen all sorts of comedies, Simpsons, So I Married an Axe Murderer, making fun of that kind of hey daddy-o kind of stuff. But you know, at its best, it isn't dated. It is quite vital and exciting, and that's something Tom McGrath explored. He was a jazz musician and a poet and playwright, and sometimes he brought them all together. So you'll see a bit of that today, but you'll also see a lot about the jazz on its own and poetry on its own. That kind of confluence is really interesting and kind of helped bring a particular freewheeling energy to the cultural scene in Glasgow in the 70s. Tom McGrath, a musician, poet, playwright, countercultural impresario, and a lot of this paper will be focused on him. So before we go into his story, I think we'll take a couple of minutes just to listen to him play. So this is from the archive, 1975. There you go. Marvelous. So that was recorded at Glasgow's Third Eye Centre, the pioneering art centre he founded in 1975. That later became the CCA in the 90s, and that recently closed. Hopefully, it can be saved in some way. It'd be a huge loss. Um, but back to the performance, he packs a lot of ideas in, a blocky modal theme, avant-garde abstraction, whole tone impressionism, a rollicking blues, and a touch of music hall absurdism. McGrath would have been writing his first play, Laurel and Hardy, around this time, so it's no surprise to hear him quoting their catchphrase, another fine mess. There's tremendous energy and invention to McGrath's performance, and his love of popular culture and the avant-garde really comes through. That willingness to mix it all up, collapse hierarchies of low and high art, class and genre is typical of McGrath and fellow travellers like Edwin Morgan, Tom Leonard, Alan Spence, Ton Buchan, and Liz Lochhead. Bourgeois respectability be damned. Art, as McGrath wrote, is what you can get away with. McGrath's vision reflects Raymond Williams' famous assertion that culture is ordinary, a lived experience. As director of the Third Eye, McGrath created a friendly environment in which people from all walks of life could experience things that zap the mind, be they contemporary art, folk music, theatre, poetry, or jazz. The Third Eye brought cutting-edge international art to Glasgow while nurturing local artists. It really is post-war cultural democracy at its best, as figures associated with the 1960s counterculture, many of them from working-class backgrounds, gained access to the resources of the state and made things happen. A living example of Mark Fisher's vision of acid communism. Jazz and poetry, together and apart, were central to Third Eye's programming in the 70s. I'll explore that in a bit more shortly, but first I'll tell you a little more about Tom McGrath. So he was born in 1940 in Rutherglen to Irish-Italian parents. He described himself as socialist by birth and found McDermott's cultural nationalism not only totally alien, quote, but something that actively excluded me. Instead, McGrath looked to Europe and America for inspiration, absorbing existentialism, Beckett, surrealism, jazz, blues, rock and roll, and beat poetry through the BBC's Third programme and publications such as Evergreen Review, synthesizing these influences with the language and culture of his home city. By his late teens, he was playing jazz and reading poetry at Glasgow's C&D affiliated club Saturday Late and a modern jazz club, The Cell. As he told Angela Barty, I started doing jazz and poetry because that was fashionable. That was what Kerouac was doing. I started reading with the rhythm section and doing blues poems. Magnus Magesson even featured his group on the BBC. CND and the broader peace movement were, quote, very significant in creating cultural forms, as McGrath said, with the presence of Polaris nuclear submarines on the Clyde providing impetus for the Glasgow protest movement. This movement overlapped with the folk scene and an emerging bohemia around the art school and university. As McGrath said, it was a really freaky time, but it was very, very dark and destructive at the same time, all beat and no hope with a bit of violence in it, often violence against the self and unhealthiness. Nonetheless, it was a highly creative period, with the Edinburgh Festival and the scene around Jim Haynes' paperback bookshop and Ian Hamilton Finlay and Jessie McGuffey's Wild Hawthorne Press helping to expand his horizons further. So in 1963, McGrath and his wife Maureen moved to London, balancing family life with adventures in the emergent counterculture. He read at Peanuts, an East End C&D club frequented by the young saxophonist Mike Osborne, and participated in Michael Horowitz and Pete Brown's Live New Departures events, which combined poetry with jazz, theatre, and experimental composition. He was also involved with Alexander Trocchi's Project Sigma and plans for a spontaneous university. In 1965, he was asked to perform at the International Poetry Incarnation at the Albert Hall, a key moment in the emergent counterculture. And some of you may have seen the film Holy Communion. Sadly, McGrath's not featured in that, but it was obviously such an important event with Ginsberg. Edwin Morgan came down to it as well, wrote a cut-up poem about it. So McGrath wrote about the event in Peace News, uh, where he was features editor between 1964 and 66, helping to implement new editor Theodore Roszak's changes, which included a modernist redesign of the paper, paid contributors, and more articles on the arts and social and political issues. And I talk about this more in the chapter that will come out next year. He went on to become editor of International Times. I knew, oh, sorry, I got noisy traffic outside. He went on to become editor of International Times, a new underground paper. As co-founder Barry Miles put it, McGrath brought journalistic experience, a love of jazz and poetry, and a spot-on sense of humour to IT. As McGrath reflected in a 1969 account of his time at IT for Scottish International, we only had the vaguest notion of what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it. But they were eager to capture the new mood. After 26 years of atheism, depression, Sartre, and suicide, the dreadful afterwar of Godot and no hope, suddenly God was back on the scene. It was as cheap, as corny, as sensational as that, yet it was sincere. End quote. For McGrath, the new movement coupled revolutionary fervour with the mystique of Zen, distinguishing it from the Marxist, anarchist, pacifists, what have you. So you can see this is something that has its roots in the kind of CND, anti-nuclear, folky, trad jazz kind of movement of the late 50s, early 60s, but it's already moving on with a younger wave of people more into sort of hippie rock and roll counterculture. So McGrath was certainly excited by aspects of this counterculture, but he never fully participated in the hippie dream, as he put it, reasoning that while peace and love is an aspect of me, I thought I'd like to go with the sinners, Trockey and Burroughs. That also meant having a pretty heavy heroin addiction, and ultimately the pressure of everything got too much for him, and he moved back to Scotland after about 12 issues to clean up. So while he had to escape London for the sake of his health and family, Glasgow was the last place I wanted to stay. It was the place where there was nothing happening. Glasgow was that kind of place. If you stayed in it, you were a failure. In 1968, he enrolled at Glasgow University, studying English and drama. Making grateful contact with younger writers like Alan Spence shook McGrath out of his post-heroin funk, and he started to realise Glasgow was maybe a place where things could happen. At 28, he felt part of an older generation and was struck to find that the new creative forms that he had helped bring in via IT were an accepted part of life for this second wave of hippies. His new friends were involved with plans for an arts lab, modelled on Jim Haynes's original initiative in London. According to McGrath, its organisers were too stoned to really get it off the ground, but it didn't matter. Seeds had been planted, connections had been made. McGrath's flat in Bank Street in Glasgow soon became a gathering place for writers, artists, and musicians. Ideas were shared and plans hatched. Inspired by the Poor Theatre, or Theatre Povera of Jerzy Grotowski, McGrath formed an improvisational theatre group come Arts Collective, The Other People, recruiting young writer friends like Spence, Gene Milton, Tom Leonard, engineer Jim Torres, and musician and actor Alan Tall. In addition to holding poetry readings with music and dance, they performed a semi-improvised play, Keep On Trucking, at the 1969 Fringe. And while the results were, according to McGrath, terribly hit and miss, the other people had an energy. So that's some footage or photograph from one of the performances. It's Alan Tall pointing at McGrath with, I think, Gene Milton sat behind him. Um, McGrath and Tom and Maureen also ran Poetry Glasgow and the Midnight Press, publishing early works by Tom Leonard and Liz Lochhead alongside his own Buddha poems. So around this time, McGrath began a long musical partnership with bassist George Lyle in the foreground and drummer Nick Weston on the left there. Two adventurous musicians who shared his love of avant-garde jazz and an interest in the guru Sri Trimnoy. Together with percussionist Alec Jimison, they formed the group Proprioception, a deliberate nod to Charles Olson, one of McGrath's heroes, who are listed as playing the Jazz and Poetry Festival at Edinburgh's Traverse Theatre in 1973 and the Jazz in the Galleries Festival at Glasgow's Maclellan Galleries the same year. Jimison, who now lives in France, describes his relationship with McGrath as very multifaceted. There was a lot of far-ranging description. Of proprioception's music, Jimison recalls McGrath saying, quote, "One time it had a real African feel, which was my thing really, and still is. There would be times where there was a very strong rhythm, there would be times where it would be much more abstract." Sadly, there are no recordings of McGrath's music from this time. However, a 1972 profile in Scottish International gives us a flavour. The performance in question appears to be more of a happening than a regular gig, perhaps influenced by the theatrical and ritualistic elements the art ensemble of Chicago were exploring at the time. It begins with McGrath and his friends sitting cross-legged, chanting Om, and leaving jazz men and audience feeling a bit spare. After a quiet start, it explodes. Whoosh, he was off, stripping to the waist. The words splutters, hacks, coughs, shouts, raspberries, howls blasting through the mic, the horns and drums, brass and whistles, reaching an incredible pitch, then all back to gentleness. So you maybe can recognize a little bit of that in the performance you saw earlier. In the spirit of Chinmoy's teachings, McGrath exercises and celebrates his demons. It's these moments, the writer concludes, that McGrath feels most alive. Quote, "A kind of total psychic orgasm takes place, all the better the more participate in it." Such activities had an influence on the people around McGrath. Alan Tall, a respected folk guitarist, credits McGrath with introducing him to the avant-garde jazz of Cecil Taylor. As Alan told me, "I thought, what the fuck is that? Up to then, jazz had been Acker-Bilk and Ken Collier." Tall remembers watching McGrath jamming with Weston and Lyle at Bank Street. He began learning flute and alto saxophone, but didn't feel ready to join his friends at that point. "My head's always been far too diatonic for what these guys were playing," he said. However, he did make a go of it and can be seen in a Third Eye video, blowing sax and flute alongside Weston in the Andy Law Project, a local band exploring new age folk and free jazz. So let's hear a little bit of that. Okay, so all quite rough and ready stuff, but yeah, great energy there. And um, McGrath, as I understand it, at least some of the members of Proprioception contributed music to Tom Buchan's 1972 play "Tell Charlie Thanks for the Truss." That led to McGrath becoming musical director of Buchan and Billy Connolly's smash hit satire "The Great Northern Wellyboot Show" the following year. McGrath and Weston also appeared on Connolly's 1972 live album, Playing the Blues. And also worth noting that the cover art is by John Byrne, who is again someone who is in this kind of circle. He contributed a lot of illustrations, comics to McGrath's newsletter Nuspeak, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a minute. So I've talked a lot about McGrath, but I wanted to say a few words about Weston and Lyle. A stalwart of the Scottish jazz and improvised music scene, Lyle was, in his later years, a key member of Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra and played regularly with musicians like Fritz Welch and Americans like Daniel Carter. He Passed away in 2016. Like McGrath and Weston, he was drawn to London in the early 60s. For a period, he shared a house with fellow Scots Maggie Nichols, a great improvising vocalist, and bassist and poet Lindsay Cooper, who McGrath went on to publish through the Midnight Press. In the jazz clubs, he saw the likes of Joe Harriott, Tubby Hayes, Albert Ayler, Peter Covald, and Barry Guy. While public performance wasn't a priority for him, he did play one gig at the Little Theatre Club, the incubator of British free improvisation. But as he recollected, it was totally deserted. He also hung out with Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, then exiled from Brazil. As he recalls, they were amazing people. So yeah, uh, also worth mentioning. George Lyle played on the soundtrack to Young Adam, the adaptation of Chalky's Young Adam. I think David Byrne was, of all the musicians who were roped in from Glasgow to play on that, but David Byrne was most impressed with George Lyle by all accounts. So Weston, who died in 2018, was a versatile drummer who worked in several idioms, but as percussionist and photographer John Gilmore argues, he was at his best playing free. Gilmore remembers first hearing Weston in a late 60s soul band with jazz guitarist Jim Mullen, who's still going, and future average white band saxophonists Malcolm Duncan and Roger Ball. He was also briefly involved with the folk rock group Pentangle. As Gilmore says, Nick did some quite remarkable things which he didn't really talk about. Weston and Lyle had their own projects, including Birth, who supported the amazing South African British big band Brotherhood of Breath at McClellan Galleries in 1974. Their take on Thelonious Monk's Around Midnight from that gig is on video. Other musicians include Dave Finlay on guitar and Alan McFarlane on alto. So let's have a blast of that. Nope. Okay. So in 1973, McGrath became the Scottish Art Council's Glasgow director, tasked with founding a new art centre. From his base at the Scottish Arts Council Gallery in Blythewood Square, so the former Society of Lady Artists building, so you can go and visit that if you're in Glasgow at any point. Um, he McGrath edited a newsletter, Nuspeak, in which he set out his plans for the new art centre and promoted local events. With its irreverent mix of cartoons, many of them done by John Byrne under a pseudonym, listings and rambling editorials, Newspeak resembled a Scottish IT. In Newspeak 3, McGrath argued that art is the opposite of alienation. The third eye was to forge an organic relationship with its locality and reject the elitism of scenes where art is something, quote, to discuss over cocktails. One of McGrath's mottos was put into place and let it happen. He wanted to facilitate discovery and creativity. And the video archive was part of that. They adopted the technology early on so they could document what they were doing at Blythewood Square and other venues like McClellan Galleries. But also, it was something that artists could use to help kind of record their own work and review it. Community groups had access to it. Edmund Morgan's In the Video Box series of poems also is kind of related to the video technology being available there. It was very much seen as as a way of that people could document their stories and their work. So the Blythewood Square Gallery became a laboratory for McGrath's programming ideas, with Allen Ginsberg and Derek Bailey among the art acts appearing there. The Ginsberg video is online. He's accompanied by a couple of guitarists, including Alan Tall. I'm going to show you a bit of the Derek Bailey performance. He was someone that McGrath certainly admired a great deal. And it's some of the earliest footage that exists of the guitarist and pioneer of free improvisation. The first generation of free improvisers like Bailey, Evan Parker, Maggie Nichols, John Stevens came out of jazz, but rather than directly imitate their African American heroes, they sought to create a free music that reflected their own experiences. So Bailey's style is angular, atonal, and really quite beautiful as you hear him develop compositional ideas in real time. Okay, stop it there. But amazing stuff, especially if you're a Bailey nerd like me. That kind of prepared guitar style, uh, kind of a guitar equivalent of John Cage's prepared piano, is something he didn't really do much after this point. So it's a pretty fascinating example of that. Um, so and Bailey has all sorts of interesting Scottish connections as well. He was from Yorkshire, but he played with Jamie Muir, percussionist and visual artist, who was also involved with King Crimson. So all sorts of interesting stuff there. Um, and then, okay, where are we? Um, okay, so in addition to the gigs uh, at Blythewood Square, McGrath helped organise gigs at venues like Partick Borough Hall, Kelvin Hall, the Apollo. So some of the big coups he pulled off at the time were Miles Davis and Duke Ellington, in what was I think his last ever Scottish gig. Uh, Duke Ellington, that is. Um, Mahavishnu at Kelvin Grove was a huge deal. Um, and also the season of avant-garde music featuring jazz improvising musicians like Steve Lacy and Ray Russell, alongside new music, tape composition stuff by Sonic Arts Union. So Alvin Lucier, David Berman, Robert Ashley, Gordon Mumma, these major American composers coming over to Partick Borough Hall of all places, which has a terrible acoustic, so isn't really used for gigs. But yeah, just amazing. You could do a fascinating tour of all these odd places amazing musicians played in Glasgow in the 70s. Um, And I mentioned Ray Russell, the guitarist. I found from the accounts for that gig that they had a fire eater, which is a theatrical flourish that has McGrath's fingerprints all over it. I think more fire eaters at gigs. I'm down with that. Um, McGrath also helped bring avant-garde composers Martin Feldman and Julius Eastman to the School of Arts Haldane building. So again, really quite amazing stuff. Eastman, black queer minimalist composer who's kind of been rediscovered in recent years, but during his lifetime was very much marginalized. So the video that we have of Eastman is really precious. And yeah, again, one of these amazing things that's in the Third Eye archive. Um, so yeah, the Blythewood Square building was um, too small really to fully do what McGrath wanted. And they sought out a larger space and they found a former department store on Sauchiehall Street, um, 350 Sauchiehall Street, and the idea was to have something that was on a main street, was public facing, so it could forge a relationship with the local community. So Garnet Hill up behind. Um, the community there were very much involved. There was exhibitions of locals' artwork, and again, the kind of video recordings that I mentioned, the video box, all part of that attempt to kind of create this relationship, organic relationship with the community, not just be this kind of parachuted in art thing. Um, Other aspects to the Third Eye that were important, it had a cheap vegetarian cafe up front. So you can see a photograph here from John Gilmore's collection. Um, the um, performance space and a long gallery in behind. Uh, the villa behind, which is later incorporated into the CCA, housed a rock and blues club, the Maryland, and the late John Kraska's pop art design studio, the Art Factory, was also up there. Uh, the programming reflected McGrath's radical vision of cultural democracy, which I've mentioned before. From community art to the international avant-garde, everything was valid. The archives show that McGrath's team was engaged with organisations like Contemporary Music Network and Victor Schoenfeld's Music Now, underlining Benjamin Pycott's assertion that far from being separate, jazz, improvised, and new classical music in this period were closely intertwined as part of a mixed avant-garde. And I think it's quite nice to use that phrase in the wider context to say all arts were included, a kind of mixed avant-garde that included theatre, poetry, visual art, and music. Um, this period really seems to capture that, and there's um, no attempt to kind of patronize the audience or decide that this is too weird for people. It's just like, here it is, you know, see what you make of it. I really admire that. It's the only way to do things, really. So the archives also revealed that McGrath was in touch with the great jazz composer Carla Bley. So I was completely blindsided when I came across a score for Bley's Concerto 3/4 in the archive, complete with a letter from her to McGrath. It seems there was a plan to perform her piece with Scottish musicians, with Bley even offering to help with rehearsals. Now, sadly, this never came to pass, a real what if, but it shows the extent of McGrath's ambition. And Bley never played the Third Eye, but she did visit it when she was touring with Jack Bruce, and they played the Apollo up the road. And apparently, she was in the audience for one of John Gilmore's bands, which is not at all intimidating if you're a pianist seeing Carla Bley out in the audience. But she didn't actually play Glasgow on her own until the early 90s with the Glasgow Jazz Festival. And there's a short film of that which on YouTube, which I'd recommend seeing. Um, So, where are we? So, around 1977, the Third Eye became the hub for Platform, which is a Scottish Arts Council funded jazz organisation. And it brought the likes of Archie Shepp, Roscoe Mitchell, Barbara Thompson, Stan Tracy, John Sermon, Chris McGregor, Peter Brotsman, Don Weller, Billy Bang, John Taylor, Kenny Wheeler, David Murray, Tal Farlow, and Red Norvo to the Third Eye. So it's a real cross section of the jazz scene, from bebop to fusion, mainstream to avant-garde. There's not so much of the gatekeeping that would later come in, where the sort of official Scottish jazz gatekeepers would keep out the avant-garde, have a very particular idea of what jazz should be. It's very open at this period. So Third Eye and through Platform was also an important space for Scottish musicians such as Head, Windjammer, Atsumevu, Kyle Keddy, Gordon Cruikshank, Crazyology, Jimmy Feehan, Bobby Deans, and Carol Kidd. And McGrath, Lyle, and Weston backed visitors like Trevor Watts and Lol Coxhill, but they also brought younger players into their orbit. Musicians like saxophonist and clarinetist Tony Gorman, pianist Jim Vincent, drummer John Sampson, and trumpeter John Sampson, drummer Alistair Morrow, and saxophonist John Longbottom. A classically trained saxophonist and clarinetist from Greenock, Gorman was at music college when he met Weston through playing in a pub band together. He told me, through Nick, I met George Lyle and that whole scene. By the time I moved to Glasgow, I was playing screaming free solos. Um, and they also became part of the sort of regular house bands or rotation of house bands, house musicians who would play with visiting luminaries like Kenny Wheeler, Art Thiemann. And many of these partnerships continued into the 80s, although there were fewer opportunities to play free music. Sadly, little of this music was properly recorded. Um, as McGrath's theatre career took off, he left the Third Eye to be succeeded by Chris Carroll, but he remained musically active, regularly performing at the Third Eye. In 1979, he organised a series of jazz and poetry gigs, including his quartet with Lyle, Weston, and Gorman, and special guests John Sampson and Karen Black. That's the actor Karen Black of Nashville and Easy Rider fame, who came up from London to the West End, from the London West End to sing and read poems. McGrath had some serious contacts, and I'm not quite sure how that came about, but it'd be fascinating to find out. Um, so, a trumpeter and Renaissance music instrument specialist, Sampson, who later went on to work a lot with Carl Ann Duffy, was roped in by McGrath to play a crumhorn solo at the start of the set. McGrath had seen him performing in his kind of early music band at the Edinburgh Festival and asked him to come and play. So um, Sampson still has the program or the outline McGrath gave to the musicians, which we can read as a kind of text score or theatrical outline. It's a fascinating insight into McGrath's way of putting a set together, combining his musical and theatrical experience. So there's, if you can see, I don't know how well you can see the slide there or read the text, but there's basically a kind of outline. So it opens with John plays crumhorn, Nick percussion, Karen reads a poem, Tom reads Poops, poem leading into Anti-Nazi March. John on trumpet, sax comes in. So it goes through that, a series of poems with certain musical accompaniments, certain cues for certain lines in the poem, and then bits where it says, Tom reads end of poem, freeform takeoff. Then they go into various things, a haiku, John Sampson gets a solo, then they have a freeform blow. Later on, there's a kind of trio feature for Tony Gorman with George and Nick. Then a New York sequence, Tom reads various poems, they work in various bits of music, there's improvisation, there's certain cues to do certain musical ideas. So it talks about C minor, 3/4 end of this, but it's really pretty open. But it's fascinating to read this framework as a way of organizing a jazz and poetry performance. It's really quite sophisticated and in depth. So let's hear a bit from Sampson. The recording here is not amazing, so you might want to turn up.
And I came across from Edinburgh as the kid from Edinburgh. And I met the team, Nick on drums and George Lyle, fantastic musician, bass player,
Yeah.
sax player, Tom, of course. And so I met for rehearsal, which we had in this little side room of the Third Eye Centre, which had a piano. I was a little bit nervous, because I was wondering what was going to happen, So because the actress Karen Black was going to read haiku, and we were going to accompany it. So he started to play, and I went, Tom. He said, what is it? I said, what key is it? What key is it? And he turned around and he said, there's no key, son. Just play. We just laughed with his whole head and body became. I'm trying to work this out. Before I knew it, there I was just playing. So that was the point. It was freeform. So life moves and goes forward. You know, it was, so anyway, we made something, a different feel for each one, which was quite a thing. So it was actually quite difficult. So I hadn't
Yeah,
really done
yeah.
jazz before, so it was very interesting, and to do it, and I was thinking, how will I remember it? And then I realised that you just had to be in a groove with people, and
Mm,
spontaneity flowed, and it was quite a
mm.
learning curve, and it was wonderful. I mean, she was also a very good singer,
Mm,
which is amazing because I'd only sort of seen her in Easy Rider, I think, and
mm,
that was, and she took it all very seriously, and obviously Tom and her were good, were good friends, and
mm,
each other very well, and she was there to do the business,
mm,
to be seriously as an artist, and not in any way kind of I'm a Hollywood star kind of bollocks,
mm.
and so it was a kind of a real happening and a wonderful night.
Yeah. Cool. So I hope you could hear that okay. Yeah. But yeah, so we can only imagine what it sounded like. But what we do have are some readings by McGrath that he did for Scottish television a few years later. Also, a couple of the poems that he read that were read as part of that performance. So I'll let you hear him reading them and try and imagine all the wild stuff going on around it.
Rashan, Roland Kirk, flutes in his nose, dark glasses, exotic headgear, blind hand steadies a microphone as he stomps and jumps and snarls and moans and grunts and shrieks and howls his free-form ragtime, 4 saxophones in his giant mouth, giant lungs and fingers propelling a heart that is close to bursting. Rashan, Roland Kirk, spins in his inflated tear, honking repeated notes above the drums as he leans over the edge of the stage. Blind hand drops down to be clasped and squeezed by those who, unseen, listen. Rashan, Roland Kirk, blind giant steps to heaven with a horn to his lips.
Tully takes the corner, a tense moment. And it's in.
There was that time Charlie Tully took a corner kick. And you know how he was always great at getting them to curve in? Well, Charlie takes the corner and it curved in. And fuck me, did the wind no carry it right into the net? But they disputed it. And the linesman had his flag up. And they got away with it. And Tully had to take the kick again. And fuck me, does he no get it in the net again? You should have seen it. It just seemed to go round in a kind of half circle above other heats. The fucking keeper didn't know where to look. And there was that time John Cassidy went into the toilet and there was no light bulb and he just had to fix up with some water he found in a bucket. And here it was piss. He didn't discover it until it was actually in him. He was very sick after that. He got very bad jaundice.
There we go. So, jazz and poetry for Tom McGrath style. As an adjunct to jazz and poetry, 1978 hang on, saw the Third Eye host Sound and Syntax, an international festival of sound poetry organised by McGrath's old friend Tom Leonard and Joan Hewson. And this, for me, is one of the most fascinating things in the archive. It's a really incredible festival, and it's well documented. There are videos of most of the performances, and it really is a real international gathering of sound poetry, with people like Henri Chopin, Jerome Rothenberg, Ernst Jandl, Lily Greenham, Gerhard Rühm, BP Nicol, Jackson Maclow. Yeah, amazing. Bill Bissett, amazing. All these people are there together. Tom Leonard performed some of his tape poems, which he dug out again, he dug out his old reel-to-reel years later and performed it in Glasgow towards the end of his life, thanks to younger musicians and poets being interested in that whole world. So yeah, endlessly inspiring and fascinating. And I think there's um, clear affinities between sound poetry, jazz, and free improvisation. Bob Cobbing, for example, the British sound poet, was played a lot with improvisers, jazz musicians, and his sound poetry often sounds a lot like what improvising vocalists like Maggie Nichols, Phil Minton do. So for this festival, Cobbing came up with Paul Burwell and David Toop, who members of the sort of so-called second generation of British improvisers, whose background wasn't so much in jazz, they were more into like rock and soul music, and weren't necessarily such virtuoso musicians like some of their predecessors, but very interested in trying different instruments, exploring different ideas. And at this point, Toop and Burwell had been very inspired by punk. They cut off their long hair, threw out their hippie cheesecloth, and bought themselves, shaved their heads and bought Doc Martens. So in Alan Spence's review for the Herald, he describes them as the bootboy accomplices. And as Toop told me, the whole kind of dynamic of their performance was they would kind of try and make a racket and put Cobbing off. And the kind of combination of Cobbing's quite uh, rummy English voice and oration with them kind of banging and clanging is really fantastic. So let's hear a bit of that. There you go, Abana. McGrath knew Cobbing in London in the 60s. He was manager of Better Books, and they would have performed together in a lot of jazz and poetry events. So it all comes full circle. Jazz and poetry, sound and syntax, Dada and music hall, a mixed avant-garde from Glasgow to Saturn, as Edwin Morgan would put it. As the Scottish jazz scene became more professionalised in the 1980s, some of that freewheeling energy was lost, with the avant-garde being pushed to the margins. However, there still continued to be lots of interesting stuff going on underground in weird places, and that spirit lives on today in labels like Scatter Archive and Glark, events like Baked Beans on the Doorstep, Jazz and improvised music remain in touch with experimental poetry. There have been some interesting projects like Atsine Muramatsu and Harry Josephine Giles, Semi-Wu collaborating with Juana Adcock, Food People, who I commissioned to do a piece based on the visitor book to Sound and Syntax, which is, so they did a kind of video poem based on that, which is really cool. Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra are often working with poets. Sonic Bothy, a wonderful inclusive music group, again incorporating sound poetry, texts, also live captioning, which is in its way its own kind of form of poetry. So dig deep and you'll still find things that zap the mind. Thank you. And that's a link there to all the Third Eye jazz project I did. All the material there is there. So there's some essays and a series of online broadcasts. So thank you.